The date, as best it can be fixed from the vessel's own log, is the 11th of February, 1897. The place is Dorian Bay, on the western side of the Antarctic Peninsula, tucked under the shoulder of Quinze Island, a narrow blackwater inlet the old charts still label in a mixture of Norwegian and French. The sealer is a small Tønsberg-registered bark working the pack ice for crab-eater and Weddell pups, one of perhaps a dozen northern boats that came south in that decade to test whether the southern grounds could pay the way the Arctic no longer did. There are 7 men on deck. The sea is glass. The light, at that hour, near midnight but not dark, is the flat blue-grey of an Antarctic summer night, the kind of light in which the eye cannot quite decide the distance of anything. They hear it before they see it. Not a cry, not a call. A sound the mate, Ole Christensen, will later describe in a letter to his sister as the noise a wet sail makes when it fills, only slower and from above. The men look up. What passes over the mainmast is, first, a shadow, but a shadow the wrong shape for any bird they know. It is not the cruciform silhouette of an albatross. It is not the hunched gull-like outline of a giant petrel. The leading edge is stretched taut between a long forward bone and a longer trailing one, and between those bones there is no fringe of feathers at all, only a smooth, faintly ribbed membrane that catches the light the way an oiled hide catches it, dull, greasy, a colour somewhere between old tobacco and drying blood. The wing does not beat, it holds, it carves. Once, twice, a slow adjustment at the wrist, and the whole apparatus banks over the yard and holds its line above the ship. They have time to look. This is the part every later account insists upon. The thing was not a flash, not a glimpse in bad weather. It glides the length of the bark at what the mate estimates as no more than 20 feet above the mast truck, and the mast truck stands some 72 feet above the waterline. The wingspan, laid against the mainyard, the men know down to the inch, is wider than the yard. Wider than the mainmast, is tall from deck to cap. Later, on paper, with the yard as their ruler, 3 of the 7 will independently put the span at between 22 and 25 feet. Call it 24. Hold that number. You will hear it again. The head is wrong. That is the second thing they say. A bird's head, at that size, ought to be small and neat, tucked between the shoulders in flight. This head is long, held forward on a thin neck, and it ends in a beak that is not the soft hook of a petrel, but a hard, down-curved point, more like the beak drawn on the old woodcuts of a stork crossed with something reptilian. And underneath, this is the detail Christensen writes twice, underlined the second time, underneath the lower jaw there hangs a pouch, a loose bag of skin, and as the creature passes over them in the long, silent second when it is directly above the deck, that pouch pulses. Once, twice, slow, rhythmic, like a lung-drawing breath through the throat. Not the swallow of a pelican working a fish down, a steady, deliberate expansion and collapse, as if the animal were breathing through the sac itself. There is a smell. They all agree on the smell. It arrives a beat after the shadow and stays a beat after the shape has gone. The smell of a seal 3 days dead on warm rock, sweet and rotten and thick enough to coat the back of the throat. One of the men, a Pharaoh's hand named Poulsen, is sick over the rail. The others simply stand. Nobody speaks. The mate later admits, in that same letter, that he does not remember giving any order for a full minute after the thing had cleared the stern and continued, still without beating its wings, toward the black cliffs on the eastern side of the bay, where it lost itself against the rock. That is the sighting. 7 men, a flat sea, an hour of Antarctic half-light, and something with a 24-foot span of leather wing and a pulsing throat pouch passing low enough over their heads that one of them, the youngest, ducked. Now I want you to hold that silhouette in your mind. The membrane, not feather. The forward carried head, the hooked beak, the sac under the jaw, breathing. because within 30 months of that night in Dorian Bay, 3 other crews on 3 other vessels in 3 other nationalities of paperwork will describe, without ever having met each other, without ever having read each other's logs, in some cases without the log ever having been published at all, the same shape. Not a similar shape, the same shape, the same span to within a foot, the same pouch, the same smell before the shadow. There is a line struck through in ink on page 140-something of the Belgica's expedition log, the one Adrien de Gerlache brought back in 1899, and the words beneath the strike-through when the archive at the Royal Library in Brussels finally allowed a clean photograph of the page in the 1960s describe a wing grande comme une voile de chaloupe, as large as a longboat's sail, gliding above the ice off Vinca in the winter of that expedition. There is an oilskin sketch, folded 4 times and kept in a tobacco tin by the widow of a Dundee whaler named James Rory, which surfaced at a Perthshire estate sale in 1974 and shows, in pencil, a creature with a throat sack and a 24-foot span, dated in Rory's own hand to the summer of 1893. There is a deathbed letter in Norwegian from a mate who did not sail on Christensen's ship, but on another out of Sandefjord the following season. And there is a Chilean naval telegram, 3 lines long, sent from Punta Arenas in January 1898, using the word murciélago, bat, for something seen over the same bay. 4 crews, 4 flags, 4 sets of hands that never touch the same paper. 1 silhouette, 1 pouch, 1 smell. Before we go anywhere near the archives, before we open a single one of those documents, I want to stay a moment longer on the deck of that Tønsberg sealer in the flat blue light, with 7 men looking up at a wing wider than their mast, and the throat under the beak breathing slowly in and out above their heads. Because whatever else the record will or will not prove in the hour to come, that is where this begins. Not with paper, with a shape. So let us build the shape, patiently, out of the 4 accounts, the way an anatomist builds an animal out of scattered bones on a table, not to prove it, to see it. Begin with the span. Christensen's crew, in the Dorian Bay sighting of February 1897, gave a figure of 7.5 meters, 24 feet and a little more, measured, they said, against the length of their own mainmast, which they knew to the inch. Rory's Dundee sketch, made 4 years earlier and 800 nautical miles of testimony away from any Norwegian sealer's mouth, carries a pencil annotation along the lower wing edge, about 24 feet tip to tip, twice the boat. The boat in question, a standard Dundee whaleboat of the period, ran between 11 and 12 feet. Twice the boat, 24 feet. The Belgica line, struck through and recovered, gives no number in feet at all, only that comparison to a longboat's sail, and a longboat's sail on a Belgian expedition vessel of 1898 ran, by the ship's own rigging manifest held at the Musée Royal de l'Armée in Brussels, between 7 and 8 meters at the foot. The Chilean telegram gives no measurement. It gives only the word grande, underlined twice by the telegraphist. But the 3 that measured the same thing. 24 feet plus or minus a foot, across 4 separate decks, across 5 years, across 4 languages. That is not sailor's exaggeration. Sailor's exaggeration drifts. This does not drift. Then the wing itself. All 4 sources describe skin, not feather. Rory's sketch is the most explicit he has drawn in careful cross-hatching the ribbing of a wing membrane, and he has written the word leathern beside it, and beside that, in a smaller hand, as if answering a question he expected to be asked. No plumage seen. The Belgica line uses the French po, skin, not plume. The Norwegian mate's letter, written in a shaking hand in a hospital in Tønsberg in 1901 and now held in the parish archive of Sandar Church, uses the word skin, the same word a Norwegian would use for the hide of a seal, and the Chilean telegram uses murciélago, bat, not albatross, not gaviota, bat. a word a naval officer in the Straits of Magellan does not reach for lightly and does not send at government expense unless he means it. Now, the head. Here the accounts converge in a way that made me sit back from my desk when I first laid them side by side. Every one of the four describes a hooked beak, long, down-curved, sharper at the tip than any albatross or petrel a South Atlantic sailor would know. Rory draws it explicitly, a raptor's hook, disproportionately large for the skull behind it. The Belgica line calls it bec crochu, hooked beak. The mate's letter says neb som en ørn, a beak like an eagle's, but longer, he adds, longer than any eagle's. And beneath that beak, in all four accounts, the thing that should not be there, the pouch. The mate calls it en pose under halsen, a bag under the throat, and says it moved, pulsed, as if it were breathing separately from the rest of the animal. Rory draws it as a distinct sac hanging beneath the lower mandible, shaded darker than the surrounding skin, and labels it, in his tobacco tin sketch, second jaw, with the question mark. The Belgica log calls it un goitre, a goiter, which in the French of the period was the word a naturalist would use for the throat pouch of a pelican or a frigate bird. And the Chilean telegram, 3 lines long, uses the phrase segunda garganta, second throat. 4 men, 4 languages, 1 anatomical feature, none of them had any professional vocabulary for, all reaching for the same clumsy metaphor. A second jaw, a second throat, a bag that breathed, and then the smell. This is the detail I find hardest to place and hardest to dismiss. Christensen's crew reported, and Christensen himself repeated to a Norwegian journalist in 1902 in an interview that ran in Morgenbladet and was then quietly not reprinted, that they smelled the animal before they saw it. A smell of rot, he said. Old meat, carrion left on ice. The Belgica line does not mention smell, but Rory's sketch has, in the margin, in the same pencil, the words, stink came first, like the trypots gone bad. A whaler's reference, the trypots being the rendering vats where blubber was boiled, and gone bad, meaning a batch left to spoil. And the Norwegian mate, on his deathbed, wrote that he knew the creature was above the ship before he looked up, because the air had changed, and the air smelled of a dead seal 3 days in the sun. 3 witnesses, 3 descriptions of carrion smell preceding the shadow, as if the animal carried its last meal with it, or as if its own body, for reasons of biology we cannot begin to guess at, smelled of decay while still alive. Put those pieces together and something coheres on the table that no known Antarctic bird will quite fit. A 24-foot leathern wing, a hooked raptor's beak longer than an eagle's, a pulsing throat pouch beneath it, a carrion stench that arrived before the animal did, and a hunting behaviour, because all 4 accounts, once you read them in sequence, describe the same behaviour of gliding low and slow over the pack ice at the edges of the bay, where the crab-eater and Weddell pups lay in their nurseries in the austral spring. Rory watched one take a pup off a floe, he wrote, clean, without settling, the way a skuar takes a chick but the size of it wrong, the size of it all wrong. The Belgica observer, in the recovered line, describes the animal stooping to the ice and rising again with something dark in the beak. The Chilean telegram does not describe hunting, it describes something worse. Because on 2 occasions, in this 5-year window, the thing in Dorian Bay took a man. The first was in the summer of 1893 from Rory's own ship. He does not name the man in the sketch itself, the tobacco tin held only the drawing, but the ship's articles for the Dundee whaler Polar Star, held at the McManus Archive in Dundee, list a deckhand named John Anderson as lost overboard, ice, February 14th, 1893, and the position given in the log for that date places the vessel within 12 miles of Dorian Bay, overboard, in sight of the ice, in calm weather. The log gives no further detail because the log was written by a captain who had 7 months of voyage still ahead of him and a crew he needed to keep working, and captains in that trade did not write down things that would empty a forecastle. The second was the incident the Chilean telegram was sent to report. 3 lines from Punta Arenas, January 1898, addressed to the Naval Ministry in Valparaiso. Translated: large flying animal observed Dorian Bay, stop bat-like span, estimated great stop Seaman Fuentes, taken from ice, January 11th stop, taken from ice, not fell through, not lost, taken. And after that telegram, I have looked, and I have had a Chilean colleague look. There is no follow-up file, no inquiry, no pension record for a widow. The name Fuentes appears once in the ministry index for that year and then does not appear again. 2 men, 5 years apart, same bay, same shape overhead. And then, as abruptly as it entered the record, the thing goes quiet. I want you to understand how completely it goes quiet. The 20th century opens on Antarctica with an explosion of eyes. Nordenskjöld winters on Snow Hill in 1902. Charcot brings the Français down the peninsula in 1904 and returns with the Pourquoi Pas in 1908. Both expeditions equipped with cameras, glass plates, trained naturalists, illustrators on salary. The Scottish National Antarctic Expedition of Bruce sits at Laurie Island through 1903. Shackleton, Mawson, the Norwegian whaling stations at Deception Island from 1906 onward. An industrial operation with hundreds of men living on the ice for months at a stretch, gutting whales in the open air, watching the sky constantly for weather. Deception Island is roughly 140 kilometers from Dorian Bay. A 24-foot animal that hunts seal pups does not respect that distance, and yet from 1900 forward there is nothing. Not a sighting, not a sketch. Not a rumour in a whaler's memoir. Not a line in a station log. The bay itself continues to be visited. The Argentine Navy charts it. The British Graham Land expedition passes through in the 1930s. Operation Tabarin establishes Base A at Port Lockroy in 1944, 7 kilometres away, and men live there year-round from that point on. 7 kilometres. And no one, in 80 years of continuous human presence, looks up and sees the wing. That is the first silence. The second silence is on the ground. If a 24-foot flying predator hunted Dorian Bay for even a single decade, it left waste, it ate, it defecated, it died. Antarctic guano layers are one of the most patient archives on Earth. Penguin rookeries at Port Lockroy and on the Winca coast have been core sampled repeatedly since the 1980s by the British Antarctic Survey, by Chilean paleoecologists at the Instituto Antartico, by Argentine teams out of the Marambio base. Those cores catch pollen, ash, feather barbs, bone splinters, fish otoliths, the microscopic debris of everything that lived and died overhead for the last 9,000 years. They catch the collapse of the fur seal population in the 19th century. They catch the ash from the 1970 eruption at Deception. They do not catch a large bat-membraned vertebrate, no hollow bone the wrong shape, no keratin sheath from a hooked beak too big for any known bird, nothing that a curator has ever pulled from a tray and been unable to place, no sightings after 1900, no remains, ever. 2 ways of not existing. And so I have to give the skeptics their due because they have a case, and it is not a foolish one. The strongest ordinary reading of this whole file goes like this. The southern giant petrel, Macronectes giganteus, is a real animal present in Dorian Bay in exactly the years in question, with a wingspan that can reach 2 meters, call it 7 feet, and a documented habit of taking penguin chicks and seal placentas off the ice. It has a hooked beak. It has a fleshy tube along the top of the bill, the naricorn that in the low raking light of an Antarctic summer evening can look, from below, like a second structure under the throat. It stinks. Giant petrels project stomach oil at intruders, and the smell of that oil is precisely the smell of rot the crews described. It flies silently on long, stiff wings. It scavenges corpses, and the men who saw it were not neutral instruments. They were scorbutic. Belgica's crew, in particular, was catastrophically scorbutic by the winter of 1898, with Frederick Cook's own journals describing hallucinations, doubled vision, a persistent sense of being watched. Cold light refraction over pack ice genuinely does enlarge distant objects. The phenomenon is documented in Scoresby's 1820 account and every polar manual since, and sailors talk. Sailors in the sealing trade of the 1890s moved between the same 3 or 4 ports, Sandefjord, Dundee, Punta Arenas, and a story told in one forecastle in 1893 could sit in another man's ear for 4 years before he saw a petrel at dusk and remembered it. I find that argument persuasive. I want to say that clearly. It explains the smell. It explains the silhouette. It explains the hunting behavior. It explains, most elegantly of all, why the thing vanishes at the turn of the century, because it was never there in the first place, only a common bird seen badly by starving men who had heard the same story in the same 3 ports. It explains the absence of bones because there are no bones to find. It explains the absence of 20th century sightings because better-fed, better-trained observers stopped making the mistake. It explains almost everything. It does not explain the pouch. Go back to the 4 documents and look at what the men actually drew. Rory's oilskin sketch, 1893, Dundee, a distinct sack hanging from the underside of the jaw, shaded darker than the throat, drawn with a second pencil stroke to indicate that it moved independently of the head. The Belgica marginal note, in the hand of the observer before the later strike-through, uses the Flemish word keelzak, throat sac, and specifies that it pulsed. The Norwegian mate's deathbed letter, dictated in Sandefjord in 1901 to a parish priest whose transcript survives in the Vestfold Regional Archive, describes on pose under haken som gikk inn og ut som et lunge, a pouch under the chin that went in and out like a lung. And the Chilean telegram is only 3 lines and does not mention it, but the follow-up sketch made by the Punta Arenas harbour master from Fuentes's surviving crewmates, filed with the port authority and rediscovered by a maritime historian in 2011, shows it plainly. A distended bag beneath the beak, drawn with the same double-lobed shape as Rory's. 4 men, 3 languages, 2 of them illiterate in the others' tongues. None of them had seen the other's drawings. And they drew the same organ. The southern giant petrel does not have a throat pouch. No procellary form does. The naricorn is a rigid tube on top of the bill, not a soft sac beneath it, and it does not pulse. Pelicans have throat pouches, and frigate birds have throat pouches, and neither lives within 4,000 kilometers of Dorian Bay, and neither has ever been recorded taking a grown man off the ice. The pouch is the detail the ordinary explanation cannot swallow. It is the one thing the shared sailor law theory has to account for and cannot, because sailor law in the 1890s did not include a pulsing throat sac on an Antarctic predator. There was no story yet for it to be borrowed from. So I am left where the file leaves me, with 4 independent drawings of an animal that should not exist, made by men who had no way to coordinate, in a bay that has since gone silent. With 2 dead men, 1 Scottish and 1 Chilean, whose names appear in a ledger and then do not appear again. With guano cores that hold no bones, with a century of expeditions that saw nothing overhead. Something was feeding in Dorian Bay in the 1890s. Something with a wingspan wider than a sealer's mainmast and a soft throat that moved when it breathed. It hunted seal pups off the black water, and twice it hunted higher than that. And then, sometime between the Chilean telegram of January 1898 and the arrival of Charcot's cameras 6 years later, it stopped. Or it left. Or the last of them died in a crevasse we have not yet cored. Stand on the deck of that Norwegian sealer again. February 1897. The mast tops, the silence before the smell, the shape crossing the sky, leather and not feather, the pouch under the jaw, filling and emptying like a lung. Every crew in that decade looked up and saw it. No crew after them ever did. What was feeding in Dorian Bay, and where did it go? I want to stay with those two names a little longer because they are the part of this file I cannot put down. The Scottish man was Alexander Cormac, 29 years old, a harpooner's mate out of Dundee, listed in the Balaena's shore party roster for the austral summer of 1892 to 1893, and then on a separate page in a different hand, listed under losses with the notation taken from the flow, cause unascertained, not fell, not drowned, taken. The Chilean was ordinary seaman Rufino Paredes of the transport Toro, 22, from Ancud, whose disappearance on the 14th of January 1898 generated the telegram that sits in the Naval Archive in Valparaiso under classification 1898-Antarctica-03, and whose family, according to a pension petition filed in 1904, was told only that he had been lost to a large bird. A large bird. The phrase is in the petition. It is underlined. His mother wanted to know what kind of bird takes a grown son off the ice and does not leave a body, and the Chilean Navy, to its credit and its shame, did not answer her. The file was closed for administrative reasons in 1911 and has not been reopened. You can request both of these documents. The Dundee roster is in the Discovery Point archive under the Balaena Papers, Box 7. The Valparaiso telegram is in the Archivo Histórico de la Armada, and any researcher with a letter of introduction can read it. I have read it. It is 4 lines long. It describes the shadow first, and the pouch second, and the man third, and the wings last, and then it says the officer of the watch will provide no further comment until debriefed on land. He was debriefed. His debrief is not in the file. It has never been in the file. Whether it was removed or never transcribed or verbally given and lost with the officer's own death in 1923, I cannot say. I can only tell you the shape of the whole, and there is the matter of the guano. In 2004, a Franco-Argentine team took 3 cores from the raised beach on the western shore of Dorian Bay, looking at nesting histories over roughly 800 years. They found what you would expect: layers of cormorant and petrel, the ordinary rain of small bones from small birds, the ordinary chemistry of a cold seabird colony that has kept its habits for centuries. They found nothing large, no keel of a great sternum, no wing phalanx too long for the species catalogue, no hooked beak sitting in the sediment above the little skulls. If a 24-foot flying predator had roosted anywhere on that shoreline for even a decade, the cores should have caught it. They did not, which means one of 2 things. Either the animal did not roost there, it came from somewhere else, from a nesting site we have not found, perhaps inland on the peninsula, perhaps on a nunatak, perhaps on ice that has since carved into the sea and taken the evidence with it, or it was never there in the numbers that would leave a trace. A handful of individuals, perhaps only one, the last of something. That is the possibility I find hardest to let go of. Not a species, a remnant. One animal, or 2, or 3, hunting a bay that in the 1890s was suddenly full of ships and full of men and full of the smell of seal blood on the ice, and for a few summers making itself known to crews that had no radio, no shared language, no way of comparing notes, and yet drew the same wings, and then finishing, old, alone, falling somewhere the cause cannot reach. That would explain the silence after 1898 more cleanly than any conspiracy, more cleanly than any misidentification. It would explain why Charcot's cameras, arriving in 1904, photographed only petrels. It would explain the ledger closing on Paredes and never opening again. It would explain why every subsequent expedition, from Nordenskjöld to Shackleton to the modern tourist ships that anchor in Dorian Bay each January, has looked up and seen nothing but the ordinary sky. But I cannot prove a remnant. I can only prove 4 drawings and 2 dead men and a pouch that does not belong to any known Antarctic bird. So stand there, one more time. February 1897. The Norwegian sealer at anchor in the black water, the mainmast dark against a sky that will not fully darken this time of year. The crew on deck, tired, cold, half of them still bloody from the afternoon's work on the floe. The smell reaches them first, that thick, sweet, wrong smell, rot in a place too cold for rot, and one of them looks up before he knows why he is looking up. And there it is, crossing over the mast tops without a sound, the wingspan wider than the spar beneath it, the leather of the wings catching no light, giving no light back, the hooked beak held forward, and under the jaw, filling and emptying, the soft pouch that no one on that deck has a word for, because no one has told them yet what to call it, because the word for it will not exist in any Antarctic field guide for another 130 years, and does not exist yet. The mate reaches for his logbook. The Dundee man, 5 years earlier and 100 miles south, had reached for his oilskin. The Belgica officer, 10 months later, will reach for his pen and be struck through by a hand that is not his own. The Chilean lieutenant, 1 summer after that, will reach for the telegraph key. 4 men, 4 instruments, 4 independent hands, and the same animal in all of them, and then nothing. The century turns, the cameras arrive, the bay goes quiet. The pouch that pulsed like a lung over 4 crews in 1 decade pulses over none after. The bones do not surface. The guano does not remember. The ledgers close on their 2 names and do not open again. And Dorian Bay, which in the 1890s was for a few brief summers the hunting ground of something the ordinary catalogue of the world cannot hold, becomes what it is today. A quiet anchorage, a postcard, a place the tourist ships stop for an hour so people can photograph the penguins on the shore. What was feeding there? What did 4 crews see in 4 different languages, with the same wings and the same throat? And whatever it was, where, in the long silence after January 1898, did the last of it go to die?